Denzel Washington stood in the first-class line, dressed simply. No entourage, no designer labels, just presence. A businessman nearby looked him up and downed his missive, arrogant. But what happened next would leave that entire cabin in stunned silence and mark a turning point one man would never forget. At Los Angeles International Airport, the terminal was alive with ego. First-class flyers stood in line with briefcases, designer jackets, and glances that said, "I matter more than you." Among them stood Denzel Washington, dressed in black slacks, a simple long sleeve, and a faded backpack over one shoulder. No spotlight, no flash, just stillness. He didn't need to posture. He never did. A few feet behind him stood a man named Albert, a high-profile executive who had grown far too comfortable being treated like royalty. To Albert, first class was more than a seat, it was a mirror. A place where people like him saw their own status reflected in the champagne, the cutlery, and the other passengers who looked just like him. So when his eyes landed on Denzel, quiet, calm, and dressed with zero regard for appearance, something in him itched. He nudged the man next to him and whispered, "Wrong line, maybe?" No one responded. The plane began boarding, and as fate would have it, Albert took his window seat in row 2, only to look up and watch Denzel quietly slide into the seat right beside him. Albert stared for a second, caught between confusion and disbelief. No briefcase, no watch, no expensive shoes. He thought, who even is this guy? Denzel opened a small worn paperback from his bag. Said nothing, just read. Albert smirked. He had no idea that in the next few hours, he wouldn't just be sitting beside Denzel Washington. He'd be sitting across from everything he had forgotten about himself. The flight had barely leveled out before the discomfort in Albert's chest started to rise not from altitude, but from pride. He shifted in his seat, glancing sideways at the man beside him who still hadn't said a word. Denzel Washington sat upright, calm as ever, reading as if the rest of the world didn't exist. No phone, no laptop, no sign of hurry or hunger for attention, just peace. And Albert hated it. To him, silence wasn't strength, it was weakness. He thrived on recognition, on dominance, on knowing where everyone in the room stood. But this man beside him wasn't playing by those rules. And that made Albert feel invisible. He decided to poke. "Didn't think they allowed economy class dress code up here," he said, sipping his whiskey, voice coated in sarcasm. Denzel looked up briefly, his expression unreadable, then returned to his book. Albert chuckled to himself. "Hey, I'm just saying, you're kind of an unusual sight in this row. Backpack? Old shoes? That book?" He gestured with his glass. "Not what I'm used to flying next to." Still, no anger, no correction, no explanation. Just quiet. Denzel finally closed his book and looked over, his tone measured, eyes steady. Comfort doesn't always look like wealth. Albert blinked. That wasn't the answer he expected. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't aggressive. It was worse, it was true. But instead of reflecting, Albert leaned back and scoffed, louder this time. "Right. And I'm sure you just enjoy looking broke." There it was, the mask off, the insult sharp. Denzel didn't flinch. "I enjoy being underestimated," he said. Albert went silent, just for a second, and somewhere, deep in his gut, a tension twisted not because of the words, but because he felt like he was no longer in control. He had tried to belittle a stranger, but that stranger had just flipped the mirror. For the next half hour, Albert kept trying to reclaim the upper hand because silence wasn't just uncomfortable anymore. It was threatening. Every time Denzel responded with grace instead of pride, Albert's ego shrank a little more. But he couldn't admit that, not openly. So he leaned further into performance. "You know, I've built companies from the ground up," he said, unprovoked. "Sat on boards, flown private, shaken hands with presidents. What about you?" Denzel gave a small smile, almost like he'd heard that line 100 times before. "I try to build character," he said. "The rest doesn't last." Albert bristled. He was used to being admired, envied even. But Denzel wasn't reacting the way most people did. He wasn't intimidated, impressed, or even curious. And in Albert's world, where status dictated attention, that felt like rejection. "You talk like a monk," Albert scoffed. "Let me guess you do motivational speaking, self-help retreats, something like that?" Denzel's expression didn't change. Calm. Still. But this time, there was something sharper behind his eyes. Not anger awareness. "No," he said simply. "I just try not to need applause to know who I am." Albert turned away, jaw tight. Because that one line, gentle as it wallanded like a stone in his chest, he did need applause. He thrived on it. Every promotion, every handshake, every compliment, it all stacked into a version of himself he desperately clung to. But sitting next to someone who didn't need any of it made that version feel hollow. Still, he didn't back down. Instead, he looked Denzel dead in the eye and said, "If you think dressing like that and talking in riddles makes you better than everyone else here, you're wrong." Denzel leaned back, hands resting lightly on his lap. "I don't need to be better than anyone, just better than I was yesterday." And with that, Albert had nothing left to say, not because he was defeated, but because he was starting to realize he was outmatched in the one arena he never prepared for: character. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight pushed deeper into the evening sky, but Albert's thoughts only grew louder. He wasn't reading. He wasn't watching anything. He was just thinking. And for a man who spent most of his life talking, selling, commanding thinking was dangerous ground. Across from him, Denzel remained still. No headphones, no show, just quiet, steady breath, and a presence that didn't demand space, it earned it. And that was the problem. Albert had tried everything's, sarcasm, superiority, personal flexes, and none of it had moved Denzel even an inch. Not emotionally, not spiritually, not socially. It was like trying to intimidate a mountain. For the first time in years, Albert felt himself cracking not in front of a boardroom, or a competitor, or a scandal butt beside a man who hadn't even raised his voice. And the worst part? That man had given him no reason to feel small. He'd only held up a mirror. Albert looked down at his hands. Perfect manicure, gold watch, smooth cufflinks. All the armor he'd built. But now it felt like costume jewelry in a room with someone real. Then, the moment. The flight attendant walked over quietly with a small tray. "Mr. Washington," she said warmly, "would you like your usual?" Albert turned. "Washington?" He blinked. Denzel Washington. The name hit him like a punch, sudden, hard, and full of shame. He looked again, really looked, and saw what he'd been blind to the whole time. The quiet strength, the familiarity, the grace. This wasn't some stranger with a backpack. This was one of the most respected actors alive, a man known not just for talent, but for dignity, for character. Albert stared ahead, 1,000 thoughts flooding in at once. The mocking, the assumptions, the smugness, and now, the weight of realization. Denzel simply nodded politely to the flight attendant, then turned back to his book unbothered, unmoved, unchanged. But Albert? He had never felt so exposed in his life. For a long moment, Albert didn't move. He couldn't. His mind reeled with every word he'd spoken since takeoff. Every jab, every smirk, every cheap attempt to feel superior, it all played back like a cruel joke, only now the punchline was him. Denzel Washington. Not just a movie star, not just a household name, but a man respected across generations for who he was off the screen. A man who had spent his career lifting others with quiet strength, giving more than he took, and walking through fame without ever needing to flaunt it. Albert had sat beside greatness and seen a ghost. Not because Denzel had Hideno, he was simply never loud about who he was. Albert turned slightly toward him, throat dry, pride cracked. "I didn't know," he said quietly. Two had no idea. Denzel looked over, not cold, not smug, just present. "I know," he said simply. There was no "I told you so," no lecture, no vengeance, just a truth Albert hadn't expected to find in a first-class cabin. "You could have said something," Albert added, almost in disbelief. Denzel closed his book, resting it on his lap. "If someone has to tell you who they are," he said. "Then maybe you're not ready to see them." The words didn't sting, they settled. And that was the turning point. For the first time in years, Albert wasn't defending himself. He wasn't justifying, comparing, or competing. He was listening. Not to a celebrity, but to a man who carried himself with the kind of peace Albert had spent a lifetime chasing in all the wrong places. He leaned back, breath shallow, heart thudding with the weight of recognition. He hadn't just judged the man beside him. He'd exposed everything empty inside himself. And somewhere between the clouds and cruising altitude, a small part of Albert finally started to change. The silence that followed wasn't awkward anymore. It was necessary. For Albert, it became a space to reflect rather than react. He stared out the window, watching the clouds slide past, but his focus was inward now. The man who had boarded that plane, puffed up with ego and dressed in armor made of status, was starting to come undone. And Denzel? He hadn't changed at all. Still calm, still reading, still composed. But now, to Albert, that stillness felt like strength, not strangeness. There was no need to prove anything when you were rooted in who you were. And that truth was starting to land harder than any insult ever could. Albert finally spoke again. But this time his voice had no edge. "I'm not used to being ignored," he said quietly. Denzel looked up with a soft smile, not mocking, just honest. "I wasn't ignoring you. I was just letting you talk." Albert exhaled, a dry, embarrassed laugh escaping. "I've spent most of my life talking," he admitted, filling space, making sure people knew who I was before I even said my name. Denzel nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "a lot of people do." Albert glanced down at his hands, then the ring on his finger. Gold. Expensive. Heavy. But in this moment, it didn't feel like success, it felt like weight. "You know," he said almost to himself, "I think I've built everything except the part that matters." Denzel didn't respond with advice. He didn't interrupt. He let the words breathe, because he knew this wasn't about him anymore. The power in the conversation had shifted, not because Denzel took control, but because he never needed it to begin with. Albert looked at him, now fully seeing the man beside him, not the celebrity, not the image, but the human being who had taught him more through silence than any mentor ever had through speeches. For the first time in a long time, Albert felt still. Not because he'd won, but because he'd finally stopped running. The plane hummed quietly in the background, but inside Albert, everything was loud. His thoughts, his regrets, his old definitions of worth, all of it collided in a silent storm behind his eyes. And yet, the man beside him remained centered, present, whole. Denzel hadn't said much, but he hadn't needed to. His presence alone had done what no critic, no failure, no scandal ever could. It made Albert see himself unfiltered, unguarded, and, for the first time, honestly. He thought about the people he worked with, how many he'd dismissed, the employees he'd overlooked, the waiters he'd ignored, the janitors he'd barely thanked. He thought about his own father, a quiet mechanic who used to say, "Son, real men don't need to say they're real men," a phrase Albert had once laughed off as old-fashioned. But sitting beside Denzel now, those words came back with a weight they'd never carried before. "Why didn't you put me in my place?" Albert finally asked, voice low, almost ashamed. "You could have embarrassed me in front of everyone." Denzel shook his head gently, looking out the window for a moment. "That's not my place," he said. "I don't need to tear someone down just because they're already falling." Albert swallowed hard. It wasn't just humility. It was grace. The kind of grace that doesn't need recognition, because it's not for show. The kind that lifts people without saying a word. Albert nodded slowly, more to himself than anyone else. "I've got a lot to think about," he said. Denzel didn't answer. He didn't need to. Instead, he offered something better, a quiet that wasn't empty, but earned. A space Albert had never known, but had always needed. For the first time in years, Albert wasn't performing. He was just real. And it felt like the beginning of something he couldn't name yet. but knew he didn't want to lose. The plane began its gradual descent, but something deeper had already landed inside Albert. What started as frustration had become reflection, and now something close to reverence. But there was still one question hanging in the air, one truth Albert hadn't yet faced. The attendant passed by again, checking trays and preparing for landing. She stopped briefly by Denzel's seat and spoke in that same warm, familiar tone. "Mr. Washington, we're about 20 minutes out. Let me know if you need anything else." Albert looked up, hearing the name again clear, final, undeniable. And in that instant, all the pieces clicked. The voice, the calm, the presence, the familiarity. This wasn't just some thoughtful, grounded man with good posture and quiet confidence. This was Denzel Washington, two-time Academy Award winner, cultural icon, a man known not just for his roles but for what he stood for off-screen, in life, in silence. Albert stared ahead, stunned. He'd been trying to size up a stranger, without realizing he was sitting next to a man who had inspired millions without ever needing to say a word. A man who had spoken at commencements, walked through civil rights memorials, sat with world leaders, and still chose to carry a worn backpack instead of a designer bag. The man Albert had ridiculed for looking out of place was someone who had redefined what it meant to belong. But the real twist wasn't just Denzel's identity. The real twist was how he chose to handle it. Not once had he used his name as a weapon. Not once had he defended himself with status. Not once had he even hinted at who he was. Because he didn't need to. And suddenly, Albert realized the most powerful person in the room doesn't need to raise their voice. They just need to be. And Denzel? He had been everything Albert wasn't, and everything he suddenly wanted to become. As the plane taxied toward the gate, something hung in the air, an unspoken shift, the kind that doesn't come from turbulence or time zones, but from truth. Albert sat quietly now, hands folded, eyes forward, unsure whether to speak or just let the weight of it all settle. Around them, other passengers began to stir, stretching, collecting bags, re-entering their routines. But a few had noticed. They had seen the moment the flight attendant said, "Mr. Washington." They'd caught the change in Albert's face, the recognition, the regret, the realization. One man across the aisle whispered to his wife, "That was Denzel." She gasped softly, not in celebrity awe, but in admiration. Yet Denzel remained unchanged. No grin, no pride, just calm. Albert finally turned to him, slower this time, more human. "I'm sorry," he said, the words small but sincere. "Not because of who you are, but because of who I was." Denzel met his eyes, not with judgment, not with pity, just understanding. "Good men make mistakes," he said. "Better ones learn from them." Albert nodded, feeling a lump rise in his throat. This wasn't about being humbled by a famous name. It was about being confronted by a quiet strength he'd never learned to respect until now. As Denzel stood and reached for his bag, a few passengers smiled at him, not because he was famous, but because they'd seen something different in him, something rare. He gave them a soft nod. No show, no performance, just grace. Albert stayed in his seat a moment longer, watching the man he had tried to dismiss walk off the plane without a single ounce of ego yet, leaving behind a presence that filled the entire cabin. And for the first time in years, Albert felt something unfamiliar. Gratitude. Not for status, not for success, but for a second chance to be better than who he was when he boarded. The airport was busy, as always. Luggage wheels hummed across polished floors. Announcements echoed overhead. Life moved on, but Albert didn't, not right away. He stood near the gate, watching as Denzel Washington disappeared into the crowd knot with a security team, not behind sunglasses, not needing anyone to notice him, just walking, quiet, free, like a man who had nothing to prove and everything already within him. Albert felt like he had walked onto that plane wearing everything that mattered: his suit, his title, his pretty hand, walked off with none of it, and yet, somehow, he felt lighter. Like the weight he carried wasn't his watch or his wallet, but his walls. That flight didn't change who Denzel was. It changed who Albert could become if he chose to. No grand speeches, no dramatic music, just one man showing another what integrity looks like in motion. Later that night, alone in his hotel room, Albert found himself doing something strange. He took off his watch and set it on the nightstand, removed his shoes, opened the window to let the world in. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't reach for his phone or check his net worth. He just sat, in silence. Not because he was empty, but because he was beginning to fill with something real. And somewhere, on a quiet flight between two cities, a man with a backpack had reminded him that greatness never raises its voice. It simply shows up with calm, with grace, and with nothing to prove. If this story made you stop and think Kevin for a second, imagine how many others need to hear it too. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that real strength is quiet, and real respect doesn't come from titles, but from character. And if you want more true stories like this, stories that reveal who we really are when the world isn't watching, don't forget to subscribe. Because sometimes, the smallest moments leave the biggest mark.